Welcome back to your quiet space after sundown, the subconscious classroom. We're so glad you've joined us again this evening. Tonight's 7-part journey walks us through locked doors, looping hallways, and buildings that were never meant to feel like home. Not all structures are made to welcome. Some were designed to disorient, to control, or simply to keep you from asking questions. But beneath the concrete and confusion, there's a deeper story, a story about why so many buildings seem to resist you. You are no longer here in the now. You are circling a windowless post office. You are tracing your fingers along walls that speak softly, not in words, but in intention. Let us begin. Part 1. The architecture that doesn't want you there. Some buildings welcome you in. Their doors are wide. Their windows smile. Their signs are clear and helpful. You know where you are, what to do, and where to go. Others seem to loathe your presence. You step inside and everything feels wrong. The air is still. The lights flicker. The corridors stretch and split with no clear reason. Signs contradict each other. Elevators hide behind concrete pillars. Nothing is intuitive. You're not lost exactly, but you're not found either. And this is not an accident. Across history, and especially in the last 150 years, entire categories of buildings were designed not for comfort, clarity, or ease, but for control. Confusion, surveillance, obstruction. Some did this to protect secrets. Others did it to pacify, manipulate, or contain. The buildings didn't simply function, they sent messages. And often, those messages said, "You're not supposed to understand this place." Let's start with one of the most quietly baffling institutions of modern life, the post office. In many countries, especially during the 20th century, post offices weren't just mail hubs, they were state organs. And they were designed accordingly. Brutalist blocks with windowless exteriors, corridors that fork without signs, lobbies that feel like holding cells. It's easy to forget that some of these spaces were intentionally designed to intimidate, to feel official, impersonal, unreadable. Especially in places with centralized power, post offices were not simply for sending letters, they were surveillance hubs. They could monitor who sent what, when, and where, and in times of political tension, they became quietly hostile fortresses. The kind of place you don't want to linger in. The kind of building that suggests, get in, do your task, leave. And the architecture reflected that. But post offices were just the beginning. Some buildings took disorientation to an art form. Consider the mental hospital. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, many psychiatric institutions were built on circular plans. Not curves of elegance, but loops. Wards arranged around rotundas. Corridors leading endlessly back to themselves. Some asylums were designed like wheels, with a central guard station and radiating spokes of rooms. Others used repeating, mirrored hallways with near-identical doors. To a visitor, it might seem merely odd, but to a long-term patient, it was deeply destabilizing. These layouts made it nearly impossible to track time or space. Was it morning or evening? Had you passed that hallway already? Was this door the one with the exit or the one that led back to restraints? Many of these hospitals were built with what was known as the Kirkbride Plan, a 19th century model for mental health architecture that emphasized symmetry, massive size, and internal separation. It was sold as therapeutic, but in practice, it often isolated and confused. Some patients were given entire wings to themselves, simply so their confusion would remain contained. Others were not supposed to leave at all. And yet the architecture didn't just confine, it gaslit. Rooms looked nearly identical. Clocks were removed. Windows were small or placed unnaturally high. Furniture was bolted to floors. Even color schemes were chosen to dull the senses. You couldn't tell what floor you were on, what direction you faced, or how long you'd been there. These were not oversights. They were design decisions. But nowhere did confusion become more calculated than during the Cold War. In the mid-20th century, both sides of the Iron Curtain built structures that weren't just secure, they were deliberately misleading. Entire military buildings were constructed with false corridors, dead-end stairwells, mirrored doors. Some had rooms with no handles. Some had floors that couldn't be accessed from elevators. One building famously included decoy offices that were never used, furnished, lit, and visible through glass walls, but permanently unoccupied. In Washington, D.C., entire office blocks were built for counterintelligence. Their layouts changed from floor to floor. Staircases ended in janitorial closets. Numbering systems skipped levels. Some doors were fake, set into walls like props. Why? Because if a spy broke in, the building itself would slow them down. It wasn't just about locks and guards. It was psychological. If the building doesn't make sense, neither will the documents inside. Across the Soviet bloc, similar strategies appeared. In Moscow, some administrative buildings included loop corridors, hallways that curved and circled back to their origin, preventing easy orientation. Internal maps were restricted. Even employees often didn't know the full layout of the buildings they worked in. This was architecture as defense, not against bombs, but against memory. And in some cases, even that wasn't enough. So came the idea of decoy infrastructure. During World War II and again during the Cold War, certain airports, power stations, and radar facilities were built as fakes. Their layouts were deliberately broken. Hangars led to nothing. Control towers were empty shells. The goal was not just to confuse, but to waste time, to make enemies spend hours deciphering a place that held no information at all. Some ghost airports were even built with working runways but no flight schedules. They buzzed with activity, lights blinking at night, guards pacing, but they moved nothing. Their entire existence was misdirection. And today, some of those ghost buildings remain, empty, echoing, and inexplicably difficult to navigate. But not all confusing buildings are about secrecy. Sometimes they're about scale. Consider the corporate headquarters of large bureaucracies, not the glamorous tech campuses, but the mid-century towers filled with fluorescent hallways and cube farms. Buildings with 10 identical floors, each with its own slightly different carpet and furniture. You could work there for years and never learn every corner. That's by design. When employees are physically disoriented, their social roles become more defined. They rely on internal maps passed down by coworkers. Don't use that elevator. It skips the even floors. The good coffee machine is hidden behind records. Don't try to find HR without a guide. The confusion reinforces the hierarchy. The building itself becomes a gatekeeper. Even educational buildings are guilty. Many universities, especially those built or expanded in the post-war boom, feature confusing layouts. Lecture halls with duplicate numbers, basement tunnels that lead to nowhere, dormitories with unmarked entrances, and always a stairwell that doesn't go to the top floor. Partly it was budget, partly it was postmodernism, but partly it was cultural. The belief that learning should involve a little suffering, that to reach the knowledge, one must first be lost. And so students wander hallways in week 3, still unsure where Philosophy 207 meets, unsure if the third floor is above or below the second, unsure whether this door leads to the cafeteria or the boiler room. It's funny until it's not, because disorientation, even mild, takes a toll. Studies show that people perform worse in environments they can't mentally map. Memory declines, stress increases, cooperation falls, and yet these buildings persist, because they don't just reflect logic, they reflect power. The more confusing the building, the clearer the message. This is not your space. Which brings us to one of the quietest and most haunting categories of all, spaces that were never meant to be welcoming. Think of certain banks, police stations, immigration offices, courthouses. Their lobbies are cold, their hallways long, their signage minimal. There are windows you cannot see through, doors that click ominously, seating that discourages comfort, architecture that pushes you toward compliance, not by threat, but by confusion. Where do I stand? These aren't just the symptoms of a poorly designed space. They're often the purpose. Because when you confuse someone, you gain a brief advantage. They hesitate, they quiet down, they submit, and in spaces built on authority, that pause is everything. But not all confusing buildings are sinister. Some are simply the result of time. Cities grow like coral. Buildings are added to, floors repurposed, departments reshuffled. A simple library becomes a maze. A clean layout becomes an inside joke. And no one fixes it because the confusion becomes part of the culture. Don't worry, someone says. You'll learn eventually. But what happens when we stop asking why it's confusing in the first place? That's what we'll explore next. Part 2: Labyrinths of Order, Control, and Display. Not all mazes are built with hedges. Some are made of stone, brick, iron bars, cement, and often they come with a key. But the key doesn't open a door, it defines who belongs inside and who never gets out. Let's begin with one of history's most deliberate exercises in disorienting space: the prison. For centuries, prisons were simply holding pens, dark, cramped, and often circular or pit-like. But during the 18th and 19th centuries, as Enlightenment ideas of criminal reform met the cold mechanics of the industrial age, a new style emerged: the architectural prison. In particular, the panopticon. It was a design imagined by English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Picture a circular building with cells lining the outer ring and a single guard tower in the center. The windows are angled so every prisoner can be seen, but they cannot see the guard. In theory, one person could watch dozens. In practice, the real power came from not knowing whether you were being watched. It was the architecture of uncertainty, and it worked. Prisons inspired by panopticon logic began popping up across Europe and America. The layout of corridors became a kind of behavioral control. If you can't tell where the surveillance is coming from, you adjust your behavior just in case. You discipline yourself. The building does not just contain your body, it trains your mind. And this logic spread. Asylums, workhouses, factories, schools, hospitals, all began adopting aspects of the panopticon model. Some literally, others psychologically. Even museums. Let's talk about those for a moment. You'd think museums would be designed to help you find things. After all, they are places of learning, collections, culture. But especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many national museums were designed to make the visitor feel not enlightened, but humbled. The ceilings soared. The signage was minimal. The floor plans were sprawling, often without clear sequence or thematic flow. Sometimes you'd wander past taxidermied animals into an Egyptian tomb into a geological timeline, without warning. And why? Because many early museums were not about accessibility. They were about display, a performance of state power, colonial reach, and institutional authority. If you felt a little lost, that was part of the show. You didn't need to understand everything. You just needed to feel small in the face of the collection. Even the idea of curating the world into rooms, stuffed birds here, ancient weapons there, ethnographic objects elsewhere, reflected a mindset of classification over connection. It wasn't your job to question the logic of the space, just to follow it, and often get confused along the way. Now let's step outside, into the city. Because urban layouts, too, have long played with confusion, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. Medieval cities were often chaotic tangles. Streets followed old animal paths or river curves. No grid, no center, just a dense web of alleyways, archways, courtyards, and dead ends. It wasn't efficient, but it worked. You knew the shortcuts. You learned by walking. Locals had a spatial intimacy that maps could never teach. But when cities grew under military or colonial rule, things changed. Take Paris, redesigned in the 1850s by Baron Haussmann. His grand boulevards carved through medieval neighborhoods not just for beauty, but for control. Wide streets meant troops could march easily. Fewer barricades during uprisings. More visibility, less resistance. The same happened elsewhere. In colonial cities from Delhi to Algiers, urban plans often split towns into confusing zones. Native populations were kept separate, sometimes by invisible lines, sometimes by walls, often by circuitous street grids designed to frustrate movement. Confusion was a tool of segregation. Even modern cities sometimes use spatial logic to steer behavior. Think of the pedestrian overpasses that seem designed to prevent you from ever crossing a street in a straight line. Or the public housing developments with identical towers, numbered nonsensically, all facing slightly different directions. Find your way if you can. Just don't stay too long. And then, of course, came the shopping mall. At first glance, malls seem welcoming, bright, air-conditioned, full of escalators and maps. But beneath the surface, many mall layouts are designed for spatial looping. Like casinos, they encourage wandering, not exiting. Straight pathways are rare. Anchors, like department stores or food courts, are placed at opposite ends, forcing foot traffic past dozens of shops. Entrances are hidden. Exits are fewer than you think. The average mall map may show 5 exits, but in reality, only one leads to where you think you parked. And it's never marked. This form of disorientation isn't about defense or punishment. It's about dwell time. The longer you stay, the more you spend. The more confused you are, the more likely you are to pass something twice. Maybe the second time you buy it. Designers have a term for this: strategic disorientation. And it works. Even some airports borrow this logic. While many are clearly marked and well-signed, others seem to thrive on your panic. Long corridors, mysterious gates, security zones that funnel everyone into one central zone and scatter them after. It's not always poor design. It's sometimes the leftover logic of multiple renovations, mismatched eras, and intentional flow control. Still, you find yourself running, always running, wondering if gate C47 is really just 5 minutes away. Even the signs can feel like riddles. Baggage claim 3, past the tunnels, up the escalator, left of the atrium, beside nothing. Every step wrapped in architectural uncertainty. But let's return for a moment to the idea of psychological impact. Because disorientation doesn't just confuse you, it changes you. When you can't map a space, your body reacts. Your posture tightens. Your awareness spikes. You become alert, but also hesitant. You question your decisions. You follow others more readily. You shrink your expectations. You submit. It doesn't take much. A hallway that loops. A ceiling that's too low. A room with no windows. A lobby with no visible door in or out. This is not fiction. Psychologists have found that people perform worse on basic memory tasks in disorienting environments. You make more errors. You recall less. You become more passive. Your attention narrows, which is precisely what some buildings want. Because in spaces of authority, prisons, hospitals, police stations, immigration offices, debt courts, your confusion becomes someone else's convenience. It slows you down, makes you quiet, makes you easy to manage. It's no wonder so many such spaces still rely on cold color palettes, repetitive corridors, strange numbering systems, minimal signage, and seating that encourages silence rather than conversation. They're not broken. They're behaving exactly as they were meant to. And once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. You begin to wonder, why is this door unmarked? Why does this hallway bend? Why does the stairwell lead only to floors I don't need? And most of all, was this ever supposed to make sense to me? Maybe not. Because sense is power, orientation is freedom, and disorientation done right is silent obedience. Next, we'll look at how architecture began fighting back. Part 3, the rebellion against straight lines and logic. For centuries, buildings had been tools of control. Prisons that taught you to walk in circles. Hospitals that made you forget what time it was. Government offices that felt like puzzles you weren't meant to solve. But slowly, quietly, a counter-movement emerged. Not a revolution in the streets, but a rebellion in materials, floor plans, and thresholds. A growing group of thinkers, artists, planners, and ordinary people began asking a very human question. What if buildings didn't have to be this way? What if architecture could refuse clarity altogether, not to confuse or intimidate, but to liberate? At first, this resistance took strange shapes. In the early 20th century, artists began turning buildings into playgrounds. The surrealists, who delighted in nonsense and dreams, designed rooms with doors that led nowhere, stairs that climbed to ceilings, furniture shaped like lips or eggs. They didn't want buildings to make sense. They wanted them to feel like dreams. Some of these designs were only theoretical, sketched in journals, whispered in cafes. But others made it into real life. Consider the Villa Savoy, designed in 1931 by Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier. At first glance, it's clean and modern, a pristine white box. But walk through it, and you'll notice something strange. The walls don't meet at expected angles. The spaces feel too open, yet too private. The path from room to room is not direct, but suggested, as if the house is asking whether you deserve to proceed. It wasn't disorientation as punishment. It was disorientation as pause, a moment to think. But soon others took it further. By the mid-century, architects in post-war Europe and America began building schools, libraries, and museums that deliberately rejected the clean, symmetrical logic of earlier institutions. Instead of straight lines and mirrored halls, they used irregular shapes, offset windows, and mismatched materials. Buildings became unpredictable, unbalanced. Some were criticized for being hostile to function. Others were hailed as breakthroughs. But all asked the same question: what if confusion could be beautiful? This was the age of non-planned planning, especially popular in Britain during the 1960s and 70s. Instead of rigid zoning and straight roads, cities experimented with organic layouts, curved housing blocks, sunken plazas, communal walkways that wound through space like rivers. The idea wasn't to control movement, but to let it emerge. Some of these places worked, others didn't, but the experiment mattered. Still, not all confusion was artistic. Some was simply bureaucratic. As modern governments grew more complex, so did their buildings. By the late 20th century, the new enemy of clarity was not control or fear, but admin. Office towers began rising with dozens of floors, hundreds of rooms, internal maps that only made sense to those who built them. Departments changed names. Cubicles multiplied. Elevators didn't go to every level. Sometimes just finding the bathroom required divine intervention. This wasn't sinister. It was just neglected. Design left behind by layers of policy and budget cuts. And so ordinary people fought back. Quietly, they made their own signs, drew paper maps, gave nicknames to rooms, carved pathways through red tape. In some city halls, janitors knew more than the managers because they had walked the building floor by floor and committed its chaos to memory. In a way, the janitor became the cartographer. And meanwhile, another trend was emerging. Corporate campuses. These weren't offices. They were ecosystems, spaces designed to feel complete within themselves. You didn't just work at the tech company, you ate there, exercised there, played ping pong, did your laundry, got your flu shot. The space was supposed to feel seamless. But seamlessness came with its own version of confusion. Many campuses were so perfectly curated, so clean and identical, that people began to feel placeless. Walk into one building and you couldn't tell it from the last. The signs were stylish but vague. The lounges were all relaxing, but forgettable. The color schemes were pastel and mute. Time slipped away. Orientation became an afterthought. In one famous case, a company's internal design team realized employees were avoiding certain conference rooms. Not because of where they were, but because the rooms had identical doors, identical lights, and no windows. You couldn't remember which one you had been in. They called it spatial white noise. The fix? Add imperfections. A bookshelf here, a plant there, a door with chipped paint. Something to help you know where you were. Because sometimes the answer to confusing design is intentionally flawed design. Elsewhere, public transit stations tried the same trick. Designers began incorporating murals, color coding, scent cues, or soundscapes, not just to beautify, but to locate. A yellow wall means you're near the east exit. A low hum tells you you're near the escalators. They called it wayfinding. It worked best when it was invisible. But not everyone wanted to be found. Artists, especially those working in installation or performance, began building spaces that deliberately resisted orientation. A room that shifted light based on how long you stood still. A hallway that changed shape when too many people entered. A mirrored tunnel where your reflection arrived before you did. These weren't failures of design. They were the point. The building became a collaborator in the confusion. Because not all confusion is discomfort. Sometimes it's wonder. Think of the first time you entered a Gothic cathedral. The vastness, the arches, the dizzying scale. You didn't know where to look. You didn't want to leave. The building broke your internal map, and gave you something better in return. That same principle drives theme parks, not just their magic, but their flow. Theme park architects. Yes, that's a real job. Spend years perfecting routes that feel spontaneous but are secretly engineered. Curved paths keep you moving. Sounds draw you towards certain corners. Benches are placed just where you start to tire. It's not confusion, it's choreography. But if that's possible, why do so many public buildings still fail? Why do airports still make us anxious? Why do hospitals still disorient us? Why do public libraries, once community anchors, sometimes feel like bureaucratic obstacle courses? The answer is part budget, part policy, but also part cultural inertia. Because we still believe at some level that clarity is a luxury, that public spaces must be hard, that comfort must be earned, that finding your way is part of the test. But it doesn't have to be. Some newer public buildings have started embracing human scale again. Natural light, clear sight lines, signs that use simple language, curves that welcome rather than twist, floors that guide with texture, chairs that invite you to stay. Because maybe the opposite of disorientation isn't just clarity. Maybe it's kindness. And maybe the real rebellion isn't confusing architecture, but architecture that helps you feel like you belong. That's where we go next. Part 4, designing buildings that want you to stay. There was a time when buildings wanted you to go away. Get in, do your duty, exit quietly. You were a customer, a patient, a suspect, a statistic, not a person with needs beyond the transactional. But somewhere along the late 20th century, something shifted. A new question began to echo in the halls of planning departments, design studios, and architecture schools. What if a building actually wanted you to feel welcome? It sounds obvious now, but for decades, empathy was not a word that appeared on blueprints. Buildings were evaluated by cost, capacity, or style, not by how they made you feel. Then came a quiet revolution. In the 1970s, a new philosophy began to gain traction: user-centered design. It started with consumer products, how to make a toaster more intuitive, how to shape a phone so people wouldn't hang up accidentally. But soon, architects asked, could we design spaces this way too? Could a building be readable? Not just beautiful, but usable? Hospitals became a test case. Until then, many hospitals were terrifying labyrinths. Cold lighting, endless corridors. No vai findin. Nurses knew the shortcuts. Patients never did. Anxiety thrived. But as medical professionals studied patient outcomes, they realized something surprising. Disorientation wasn't just inconvenient, it delayed healing. Patients who felt lost were more likely to report pain. They were slower to trust their doctors. They asked fewer questions. They even left earlier against medical advice. So hospitals began to change. Not drastically, but quietly. Windows were added to waiting rooms. Signs were color-coded and bilingual. Carpets had patterns to suggest direction. Courtyards were reintroduced, not for prestige, but for grounding. Nature, it turned out, helped people find themselves. Even elevators began speaking, announcing floors aloud, lighting up panels clearly, guiding visitors not just up and down, but forward. This wasn't luxury. It was care. And it worked. Retail followed close behind. Department stores, long obsessed with keeping customers inside, realized that customers actually spent more when they felt calm. IKEA was one of the few exceptions, a deliberate maze, yes, but even that maze included shortcuts, arrows, rest spots, and maps at regular intervals. It was a game, not a trap. Elsewhere, designers began testing what made spaces legible. One study compared two nearly identical office buildings, one with floor-to-ceiling glass, one with small inset windows. Workers in the glass building took 40% fewer wrong turns their first month. Just having visual contact with the outdoors helped them anchor themselves. This insight rippled out. Schools began to embrace open plans, not as an experiment in chaos, but as a strategy to reduce hallway traffic and improve transitions. Libraries ditched fortress-like stacks in favor of discovery layouts. Curved shelves, central gathering areas, nooks for reading, clear signage. And museums, once the cold palaces of national pride, softened. Wall text became friendlier. Floor plans included suggested paths. Audio guides told you where you were, not just what you saw. Visitors stayed longer, learned more, and felt less like they were trespassing in someone else's culture. But not every space followed. Government offices, in many parts of the world, remained stubbornly unreadable. Endless forms, numbered counters, acrylic partitions, carpets that hadn't been replaced in decades. The logic of confusion still lingered, a holdover from institutional inertia. Many buildings still told you, you're not meant to enjoy this. You're meant to comply. And yet, even there, change was creeping in. In cities like Copenhagen and Melbourne, public services began experimenting with open counters, child-friendly spaces, and quiet rooms. The idea was not to coddle, but to acknowledge that public life didn't have to be punishment. Even prisons began to evolve. In Norway, correctional facilities like Halden Prison reimagined their buildings not as punishment machines but as communities. Cells had windows. Hallways were short and clear. There were kitchens, gardens, and spaces for conversation. The architecture said, "We expect you to rejoin society, so we'll treat you like a person." Critics scoffed, but recidivism dropped. Because orientation, it turns out, is not just spatial. It's moral. A building tells you how it sees you, as a problem to be processed or as a person to be guided. And people notice. There's a term in design, hostile architecture. You've seen it. Benches with center bars to stop sleeping, spikes on flat ledges, rounded steps to prevent sitting. These are messages disguised as design. They say, you don't belong here. But there's an opposite idea, too, dignity architecture. It's subtle. A bench under a tree, a ramp instead of a staircase, a clear path to the entrance no matter your pace, a quiet place to rest without having to buy something. These are buildings that invite, not repel. That whisper, "You're welcome here." Sometimes it's in the details. A public restroom that has hooks for bags, a courthouse that uses natural light, a school that places windows at a child's height, not just the teacher's. These aren't expensive changes. They're human ones. And yet they have immense power. Because when people feel seen by a space, they act differently. They linger, they speak up, they collaborate, they feel less defensive, more open. And the building becomes not just a structure, but a partner. Even airports have tried. Singapore's Changi Airport is frequently ranked the most user-friendly in the world. Not because of luxury lounges, but because of clarity. Clean signage, logical terminals, indoor gardens, waterfalls, rest zones, spaces that remember you are tired, anxious, and moving. It's no accident. It's design. And in a strange way, we've come full circle. Where once we built buildings to confuse, intimidate, or control, we now ask them to explain, soothe, invite. Not because we're weaker, but because we understand more. About psychology, about accessibility, about how space shapes behavior. We've realized that clarity is not a compromise. It's a kind of care. And it raises a new question. If a building can be designed to make you feel welcome, why would we ever return to buildings that don't? In the next part, we'll explore the spaces that still resist that shift and the quiet resistance that lives within them. Part 5. Spaces that still want you disoriented. Not all buildings accepted the memo. Even as user-friendly airports, therapeutic hospitals, and human-scale libraries reshaped expectations, some structures held onto their old logic. Some still want you to feel small, still want you unsure, still want you to obey without understanding. And they're often hiding in plain sight. Let's begin with one of the most unnerving places many people will ever enter: the courthouse. Step inside and you might notice something immediately, almost too immediately, a strange tension. It doesn't come from shouting or confrontation, but from the building itself. Cold materials, fluorescent lighting, heavy doors with unclear labels, benches bolted to walls, signs that say silence in capital letters. No one tells you where to go or why. The hallways are long, but not wide. Elevators feel like freight carriers. Security guards give directions like riddles. You may find yourself standing outside the wrong courtroom, on the wrong floor, holding the wrong papers, wondering if you've already failed. And that's the point. Courthouses are not designed to feel understandable. They're designed to feel hierarchical. The judge sits high, the public sits low. The architecture reminds you, you are not in control here. And yet, not everyone experiences that equally. Defendants and families feel it most intensely, but even jurors, witnesses, or staff describe courthouse architecture as disorienting. Some buildings have courtrooms arranged non-sequentially. Room 301 is next to 507. Some floors have split levels without signage. Restrooms are intentionally hidden to minimize loitering. It's not inefficiency, it's messaging. And courthouses are not alone. Immigration offices in many countries are masterclasses in spatial uncertainty. You walk in and face a wall of windows. The counters are numbered, but the numbers are not called in order. There are signs, but they contradict each other. Fill out Form A before seeing a clerk. See a clerk to receive Form A. There's no clock. The chairs are too close together or too far apart. The lighting is harsh. There are televisions playing silent public service announcements no one watches. Children grow restless. Elders grow tired. Everyone waits. It is a designed bottleneck. Not to serve you, but to process you. And the less you understand, the less you resist. This design logic is not always malicious. Sometimes, it's simply the result of decades of rules layered like sediment, fossilizing past intentions into present confusion. Other times, it's budget. No one upgrades a confusing layout because fixing it means acknowledging that it was never meant to be welcoming in the first place. But sometimes it is intentional. Financial institutions have long used space to signal importance, impenetrability, and distance. Think of the lobbies of major banks: marble floors, high ceilings, echoes, security guards standing still. You approach a counter, only to be told that this counter cannot help you. You must take the elevator to the mezzanine, which is not a floor. You're not sure where to go, so you ask someone who doesn't work there. They've also given up. They're just waiting, maybe for a manager, maybe for permission. Banks aren't supposed to be cozy. They're supposed to make you behave, to keep you from lingering, to make you feel as though you've entered a zone where your presence is tolerated, not invited. And the same can be said of certain universities. Older academic institutions, especially those built in the classical or Gothic style, are often beautiful, but they're also confusing by design. Quadrangles with identical doors, lecture halls labeled with codes only registrars understand, offices hidden behind unmarked stairwells, libraries with multiple entrances but only one working exit. Ask a student for directions and they'll laugh. No one knows where that is. Even the staff get lost. And that confusion does something subtle. It sorts people. Those who know the campus seem smarter, informed, belonging. Those who don't, outsiders. You start to think, maybe I don't belong here. It's an architecture of gatekeeping. Even transport hubs, which could prioritize clarity, often revert to chaos. Bus terminals with platforms that renumber without explanation. Train stations where the signage is retrofitted, patched in like duct tape. You arrive 5 minutes early and still miss your connection. Not because you were late, but because no one told you where to go. It's easy to say they should fix that, but the design itself reflects priorities. When people aren't the priority, the space lets them know. And the people notice. Disorientation doesn't just inconvenience, it reshapes how you behave. You lower your voice. You defer to uniforms. You hesitate to ask questions. You stay in your lane. You internalize the building's logic. You are not in charge. Even museums and galleries, places once devoted to culture and insight, have leaned into coldness. Ultra-minimalist layouts, labeling systems so abstract they require guidebooks, interactive exhibits that require a smartphone, a QR code, and a third hand. You're expected to keep up, but not everyone can. In a truly hostile space, there are no clear exits, no restrooms, no water fountains, and no signs saying, "We see you, you're welcome here." Which raises the question, where do people turn when buildings reject them? Sometimes they leave, other times they resist. In some cities, activists have created guerrilla signage campaigns, putting up homemade wayfinding for shelters, clinics, or transport. In refugee camps, residents build their own maps, drawn in chalk or painted on walls, guiding newcomers to food or clean water. In hospitals, nurses quietly reorient patients by taping arrows to walls. In schools, students make cheat sheet maps for freshmen. In government offices, volunteers wait outside to explain procedures that should have been explained inside. These aren't just hacks, they're acts of compassion. Because the building didn't care, but someone did. And those small gestures start to spread. Eventually, administrators notice. Designers are hired. A new plan is proposed. Someone says, "Why is this hallway shaped like that?" And someone else answers, "No one knows. It's always been that way." And for the first time, they question it. Sometimes questioning is all it takes. In the next part, we'll follow the people who didn't just question confusing spaces, they reimagined them from the ground up. Part 6, the architects who fought the maze. Not everyone accepted that disorientation was inevitable. While some institutions clung to confusion like it was a secret language, others began to build something entirely new. spaces that made sense, not just spatially but emotionally. It wasn't about simplicity, it was about decency. Let's begin in the unlikeliest of places, a prison. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a handful of countries began experimenting with correctional facilities that looked, well, livable. In Norway, the Halden prison redefined what a secure building could be. Its layout wasn't hidden or twisted. Instead, it was clear, calm, and grounded in nature. Windows faced trees, not concrete walls. Walkways had natural light. Cells had doors, not bars. There were sight lines, not blind corners. And yet, it was still a prison, secure, controlled. But it didn't humiliate. It oriented. That word matters. Because orientation is more than wayfinding. It's a signal. You belong here. You are not lost. You are not in danger. In education, this idea gained momentum. Architects began designing schools with central commons, glass-walled classrooms, soft curves instead of hard corners. Instead of long, anonymous corridors, schools began creating learning neighborhoods, clusters of rooms that made students feel part of a community, not a conveyor belt. Research showed that when students understood their environment, they performed better, especially students from marginalized backgrounds who were often most impacted by institutional confusion. Even something as simple as knowing where to go increased trust. Museums changed too. One example, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. When it opened in 2016, visitors remarked not just on the exhibits, but on the flow. You begin in the lowest level, deep underground, where the history is painful. Slavery, resistance, survival. Slowly, as you ascend through the exhibits, the ceilings rise. The light increases. The stories widen. Until finally, at the top, the museum opens into glass and sky. It's not just a building, it's a journey. You don't need a map. The space tells you, keep going. There is light ahead. That's good architecture. Hospitals, too, began changing, not just for patients, but for staff. Nurses once navigated brutal floor plans. Long hallways, endless turns, no visual landmarks. It wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. One wrong turn, one missing supply cart, and a life could be lost. So designers started asking nurses what they needed. The answers were basic: visibility, proximity, rest space, quiet corners to breathe. And so new hospitals began to emerge. Not grand, not flashy, just helpful. Windows at nurses' stations, decentralized supply closets, curved units so patients were never too far from help, signage that didn't require a degree, flooring patterns that subtly guided you toward exits. It was design at support staff. Even in cities, the change is visible. Urban planners began rethinking the way people navigate daily life. Some added pedestrian-level signage, not towering placards meant for drivers, but small, human-height maps with real walking distances, not crow's flight illusions. Others added tactile paving for the visually impaired, scent gardens near transit hubs, sound cues for crossings. Not because it was trendy, but because it said, you are part of this city, too. One example, the city of Tokyo, where subways often include station-specific musical chimes to signal arrivals, not just for fun, but to reduce stress. If you fall asleep on the train, the song wakes you. If you're disoriented, the sound tells you where you are. It's elegant and kind. This principle even made it into disaster architecture. After hurricanes and earthquakes, many emergency shelters used to be placed in repurposed gyms, hangars, or auditoriums. But people got lost, scared, confused. So architects began designing modular shelters with intuitive flow. Clear entry, simple partitions, restroom access visible from every point, color-coded sections, kids zones, elder spaces, pet-friendly areas, places that didn't feel like a last resort, but like care, because clarity is a form of dignity. And then came trauma-informed architecture. This field asks a hard question. What if the people entering this space have already suffered? What if the building itself could be a form of healing? It's being used in domestic violence shelters, refugee housing, veteran support centers, and therapy clinics. The design avoids triggers, no slamming doors, no glaring lights. Paths are predictable. Rooms are private but visible. Entrances are discreet but welcoming. There are exits everywhere. Not because people are trying to escape, but because knowing they can brings calm. Even churches have evolved. Some modern sanctuaries reject traditional aisles and pews. Instead, they offer round seating, skylights, soft acoustics, places to linger, to breathe, not just to worship, but to be. Because orientation is not just about finding your way around. It's about finding your way in. And some of the most innovative spaces aren't public, they're digital. App designers, game developers, and virtual world builders are now grappling with spatial confusion. How do you guide a person through a space with no gravity, no friction, no physical presence? Their answer: cues, lighting, sound, motion, the same tools used in physical space but distilled. When a game feels good to explore, that's design. When an app makes sense without a tutorial, that's empathy. And now, physical architects are learning from their digital peers. They're borrowing ideas, dynamic signage, responsive walls, shifting layouts that change based on crowd flow, airports that redirect based on real-time data, museums that dim or brighten based on visitor stress levels. Architecture is becoming interactive, not because it's trendy, but because it's human. The old model, confuse, contain, command, is being replaced by something softer, something smarter. Not every building gets it right. Some never will. But a growing number of architects now ask, will this space make someone feel stupid? Will they be lost? Will they be afraid?